Story number 1. The vanishing in Pinhoti Forest. We had no idea it would end like this. It was supposed to be just another camping trip. A weekend away from everything. A chance to clear our heads. To escape the noise of the world and just be in nature. Like we had done so many times before. But this trip to the Pinhoti Forest in Alabama was different. It was the kind of trip that sticks with you. But not for the reasons you'd want. And it's the kind of trip that, no matter how many years pass, you'll never be able to forget. I was there with John, my best friend since high school, and for other guys, Mike, Jake, Eric, and Tom. We all had our reasons for wanting to get away for a weekend. John was the one who suggested it. He always had a taste for adventure, always the first to push us into something new. The Pinhoti Trail is supposed to be amazing, he said, as we piled into the cars, our backpacks filled with gear, food, and the usual assortment of alcohol we thought we might need to make the trip more fun. The Pinhoti Forest is deep in the mountains of Alabama, vast and untamed, the kind of place where the trees stretch high above you, where the underbrush thickens into shadows, and the air smells of earth and pine. We had hiked parts of it before, but this was different. We were going to camp near the trailhead and spend the next 2 days hiking deeper into the woods, getting away from everything. By the time we set up camp, the sun had already begun to set, casting a red-orange glow over the tree line. The fire we built crackled in front of us, and we sat around it, talking and laughing, the kind of carefree chatter that only comes when you're miles away from the world and in the company of friends. John, always the storyteller, was telling one of his wild tales, something about a ghostly figure he had seen near an old abandoned house when he was a kid. But that night, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious at first. It was just a feeling, something creeping at the edges of my awareness. Like when you hear a twig snap in the dark but convince yourself it's just the wind. The trees around us shifted and groaned in the breeze, and the firelight flickered as the wind picked up. John seemed on edge too. He kept looking into the woods, like he was seeing something just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Do you guys hear that?" John suddenly asked. His voice was low, almost a whisper. We all stopped. The wind had died down, and for a moment, it was eerily quiet. No insects, no birds, no rustling in the trees. "Just the wind," Mike said, shrugging. "Don't be so jumpy." But John didn't look convinced. He stared into the woods, his eyes narrowing as though he was trying to focus on something in the distance. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I think I'll take a walk, clear my head." None of us thought much of it. John had always been the kind of guy who liked to wander off into the woods when he needed space. We figured he'd be back in an hour or so, just looking for some peace and quiet. The rest of us stayed by the fire, talking in low voices, occasionally throwing another log on the flames. But as the night wore on, John didn't return. First, it was just a small worry. Maybe he got lost. Maybe he was off exploring and lost track of time. But as the hours passed and the darkness deepened, I started to feel the unease spreading through the group. "We should go look for him," Jake said after a while, standing up and grabbing his flashlight. "I'll go with you," Mike added, though his voice was laced with hesitation. "But it's late, man. It's way too dark to be out there by ourselves." Still, we couldn't sit there while one of our own was lost in the woods. So we set out, flashlights in hand, calling John's name as we trudged into the trees. The forest swallowed us up almost immediately, the trees pressing in on all sides, their twisted branches creaking and groaning like they were alive. The air felt thicker, almost oppressive, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. We searched for hours, the darkness so deep it felt like it was pressing in on us from every side. But there was no sign of John, no footsteps, no broken branches, no sign that he had been anywhere near us. We called out to him, our voices echoing off the trees, but there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind and the rustling leaves. By the time we finally gave up and returned to camp, none of us spoke. We didn't have to. We all felt it, the same sinking, hollow feeling in our chests. Something was wrong. The next morning, we notified the authorities. A search party was quickly organized, and within hours, the woods were crawling with park rangers, volunteers, and even search dogs. They scoured the area, combed through the trails and the underbrush, but it was like John had vanished into thin air. There were no signs of struggle, no signs that he had been anywhere near us, just an empty, silent forest. And then they found it. A few miles from our campsite, they discovered John's backpack. It was sitting neatly on the ground, as though he had just dropped it and walked away. His gear was still inside, his water bottle, his map, even his jacket, but there was no sign of John. No clues. They didn't find anything else. No footprints leading away from the backpack. No sign of a struggle. Just an abandoned backpack in the middle of the forest. To this day, no one knows what happened to John. His disappearance remains unsolved. One of the many mysteries surrounding Pinhoti Forest. People talk about it, how the forest is strange, how people have gone missing there before, and how sometimes you can feel a presence, something watching you from just out of sight. Some say it's the ghosts of the people who vanished over the years. Others claim it's something darker, something older than human history. But the truth is, no one knows. I still don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. When I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the sound of John's footsteps in the leaves, his voice calling out to us from the woods. But when I open my eyes, I know he's not there. And the last thing I ever heard him say before he disappeared, before the woods swallowed him whole, was, "Something's wrong here, guys. Something's wrong with this place." Maybe he was right. Maybe he knew something we didn't. Maybe the forest knew something we could never understand. Story number 2. The footprints in Yosemite. We thought it was going to be one of those trips that would stay with us forever. The kind of trip you look back on when you're older and laugh about. Maybe even with a hint of nostalgia. A weekend camping in the wilds of Yosemite National Park. Surrounded by towering granite cliffs, giant sequoias, and the crisp mountain air. We were a group of 6, me, my best friend Mike, his girlfriend Sarah, and 3 others, all of us university students with a penchant for adventure. Yosemite was a place of legend, a place where the beauty of nature was so overwhelming it made you forget everything else. We arrived early on a Friday afternoon, the sun still high in the sky, casting long shadows over the towering peaks. The campground we'd chosen was one of the more isolated ones, nestled in a quiet valley by the Merced River. It was perfect, far enough from the crowds, but close enough to the trailheads we wanted to explore. The only sounds we could hear were the calls of birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the occasional splash of fish jumping in the river. It was everything we had hoped for. We spent the day hiking, taking in the awe-inspiring views, the waterfalls cascading down the cliffs, the lush forests around us. It was exactly the kind of experience we'd wanted, a chance to get away from the noise of the world and just be present. By the time night fell, we were all exhausted, content with the day's adventure. We built a fire, made s'mores, and sat around telling stories, stupid, funny stories about life, school, and everything in between. It was the kind of campfire bonding that always felt like it was going to last forever. But as the night deepened, something began to change. First, it was small, a whisper of wind, a flicker of movement at the edge of the firelight, something you could easily dismiss as your imagination. But then, Sarah went quiet. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. We all fell silent, trying to catch the sound. There it was again. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps, light and deliberate, crunching softly on the dry leaves and pine needles. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the animals. It was footsteps, someone walking around our campsite. We all froze, staring at Sarah, who was now sitting up straight, her eyes wide in the flickering light. "You hear it too, right?" she asked. Mike was the first to stand, trying to shake it off with a nervous laugh. It's probably just a deer or something. They wander around at night. But the more we listened, the more the sound became clear. It wasn't the irregular pattern of an animal's movements. No, it was something else. Steady, measured, like someone was pacing around our camp. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I stood up and walked to the edge of the firelight, squinting into the dark beyond. But I saw nothing, just the towering shadows of the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The air was thick, cold, and still. Then, it stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence, too much silence. We all looked at each other, waiting, half expecting the sound to return. But it didn't. Sarah let out a shaky breath. Okay, I'm freaking out now. I turned to Mike, who seemed just as unnerved, but he shrugged it off. Let's just go to bed. There's nothing here. We all reluctantly agreed, though none of us really wanted to sleep after that. We made sure the fire was well contained and retreated to our tents, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at us. The next morning, the sun rose with an unsettling warmth that didn't quite shake off the chill of the night before. As we packed up our gear, ready to hit the trail again, I noticed something strange. There were footprints. First, I thought they were just animal tracks. Maybe a bear or some large cat had passed through. But as I looked closer, I realized they were too perfect, too human. The prints were clear, deep impressions in the soft earth near our camp, leading from the tree line and disappearing into the shadows of the forest. But here's the thing. None of us had gone out of the camp during the night. We hadn't left the fire, hadn't strayed from our tents. Who left these? Ben asked, his voice flat, a little unnerved. We were all here last night, Mike said, looking at the prints. Nobody left. Sarah looked like she was about to say something, but stopped herself, eyes flicking nervously to the trees. And then I saw it, the most unsettling part. The footprints didn't stop at the edge of the camp. No, they circled around us, walking in an eerie, deliberate pattern, as though someone had been walking around our campsite, watching us. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that, in the center of the ring, right where we'd all been sitting around the fire, there was a set of smaller prints, child-sized. I don't know how long we stood there in silence, but I do remember the dread settling in. Felt like we were being watched. I don't like this, Sarah whispered, and we all felt the same. Something was wrong, very wrong. We broke camp quickly, packing up everything in a rushed frenzy. As we started the hike back to the car, the feeling of being followed never left. The footsteps, the presence, the feeling that we were not alone. It lingered with us every step we took. It wasn't until later, after we left Yosemite, that we learned the full story of the place. Apparently, Yosemite had a long history of strange disappearances, more than any other national park in the United States. Dozens of people had gone missing over the years, never to be found again. Some believed it was the forest, the mountains, the wildness of it all. Others whispered about something darker, spirits, entities, the ghosts of those lost in the wilderness, still wandering the woods, still searching for something or someone. And after that night, we all wondered if maybe we had walked too close to something that we shouldn't have. Something that had followed us back from those deep, dark woods, the footprints in the dirt, the whispers in the night. It was as if we had stepped into a place where the veil between the living and the dead was too thin. We never spoke of it again, and none of us ever went back to Yosemite. Story number 3. The Cry of the Lake. It all started with a dare. We were just a group of college kids looking for a thrill. The kind of thrill you can only get when you're young, stupid, and convinced that nothing could hurt you. I was with my 4 best friends, Jake, Lucy, Ben, and Carla. We had spent months planning this camping trip, and there was no way we were going to let anything stop us. Not even the rumors that swirled around the area, the stories about the Crybaby Lake. and the children's voices that some said you could hear late at night. Jake was the one who suggested it. He was always the instigator, the guy who pushed us beyond our comfort zones, the one who would say things like, "Come on, it's just a bunch of ghost stories. Don't be a baby." So we piled into his beat-up van and drove the 3 hours north to Michigan's woods, to a place called Crybaby Lake. The lake wasn't anything special at first glance. It was small, surrounded by thick trees, with a single, lonely dock that jutted out into the water. There were no houses nearby, no roads, no other campers for miles. Perfect for us. It wasn't until the evening settled in that I started feeling uneasy. I hadn't wanted to admit it, but the air felt strange here, thick, almost heavy, and there was something about the silence that unnerved me. The trees were too quiet, the wind too still, but I pushed those thoughts aside, telling myself it was all in my head. That night, we built a fire at the edge of the lake. We roasted marshmallows, made s'mores, and cracked open beers, laughing and joking like we had for years. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the stars above us were scattered across the sky like silver dust. It was supposed to be perfect, and for a while, it was. But then, we heard it, a soft sound at first, like the wind, like a faint cry. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably a raccoon or something, I said, trying to sound casual. But then it came again, louder this time, the sound of a child, a little girl, sobbing from somewhere in the woods. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. This is it, the ghost stories. You guys are getting to me. Jake grinned. Just a bunch of critters messing around. Maybe some lost hikers or something. It's all good. But the crying, it didn't stop. It grew louder and closer, a drawn-out, pitiful wail that seemed to seep into the very bones of the night. The fire flickered as a sudden chill swept over us. Lucy looked around, her face pale. "It's not an animal," she whispered. That's a child." I tried to brush it off. I really did. There's nothing out there. It's probably some stupid prank or echo. No way there's a kid out here. But as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The sound was too real, too human, and it was getting closer. Ben stood up, his voice unsteady. "We should go check it out. Maybe someone's in trouble." Carla, usually the voice of reason, was shaking her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No, we shouldn't. Let's just stay here." But Ben wasn't having it. "I'll go. I'll take a look. You guys stay here." He grabbed a flashlight, and before anyone could stop him, he was already heading into the trees. We watched him disappear into the dark, the beam of his flashlight cutting a thin line through the blackness. The rest of us sat in silence, the crying growing louder with every passing second. I don't know how long it was before Ben came running back, his face as white as the moonlight. "There's someone out there," he gasped, breathless. A figure. It was just standing there, a shadow. But it wasn't a person. It was something else, something wrong. Before any of us could ask more questions, he had already collapsed to the ground beside the fire, visibly shaking. It disappeared when I tried to get closer. It was just standing there, and then it was gone. I didn't know what to think. My gut was telling me to leave, but part of me wanted to be brave, wanted to prove to everyone that there was no such thing as ghosts, no such thing as the supernatural. So, we did what any dumb group of college kids would do. We decided to check it out. We walked into the woods together, the flashlight beams trembling in the dark, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. The air was still, so still that it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. And then we saw it. First, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow, tall and thin, standing between the trees, its shape shifting as though it were made of smoke. But as we got closer, I could see it more clearly, too clearly. It was a figure, a man-shaped thing, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too small, and its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were just too hollow, black pits. Before I could say anything, the figure vanished, as if it had never been there at all. We froze in place, our hearts pounding in our chests, too terrified to move or speak. And then we heard it again, the crying, louder than ever. It was coming from right behind us. We turned and saw it. A little girl. She stood at the edge of the woods, her back to us, her body hunched forward, her hands hanging limp by her sides. She was crying, her sobs racking her small body as if she were in pain. But there was something about her that was wrong. Something in the way she stood, unnatural, twisted. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The others were frozen, too. Carla was the first to break the spell, her voice shaking as she whispered, "We need to go, now." And that was when we saw it. The thing we hadn't noticed before, on the ground, just a few feet from where the girl stood, was a small, old cloth bag. It looked ancient, the fabric worn and faded with age. We cautiously approached it, and when we opened it, we found what we least expected: a collection of old, dusty toys, broken dolls, wooden soldiers, and cracked marbles. They were all there, stuffed into the bag as if they had been left behind in a hurry. Ben picked one of the dolls up, holding it with trembling hands. It was a simple thing, a porcelain face cracked in two, its dress torn and stained. But what caught my eye wasn't the doll itself. It was the name etched into its base. Crybaby. That's when we heard it. A voice, soft and whispering, coming from the trees. A voice that wasn't the girl's. "Leave," it said. "Leave or face the curse." The voice faded, and with it, the crying. The air seemed to snap back to normal. But the fear that gripped me was unlike anything I had ever felt before. I turned to the others, and without a word, we ran. We didn't stop until we were back at the campsite. And even then, none of us wanted to sleep. We gathered our things, packed up in a frantic blur, and left the lake behind, not daring to look back. We never spoke of it again. And as far as I'm concerned, the Crybaby Lake is still out there, hidden in the woods of Michigan, waiting for the next group of fools to wander too close. And if you ever hear a child crying in the dark, don't go looking for them, because once you do, it's already too late.